Welcome to the case of the Treasonous Tide, a Sherlock Holmes adventure from the series Sherlock Holmes, the Sussex Apocrypha, playing in the year 1916. Many believe my friend's career concluded when he retired to the Sussex Downs. Yet a coded ledger, discovered only decades later, reveals otherwise. It details cases from those later years, mysteries too personal or sensitive for my contemporary accounts. These chronicles, which might be called his Sussex Apocrypha, show a Holmes grappling with a world changing irrevocably around him. I shall begin, then, with a matter of grave national import that arose during the Great War. I present to you the case of the Treasonous Tide. Chapter 1. Among the many case ledgers my friend Sherlock Holmes compiled during his years of quiet retirement upon the Sussex Downs, the one marked the Treasonous Tide is perhaps the most sombre. I turn its pages now, the scent of old paper and dried ink filling my study, and I am transported back to that cottage, to the low roar of the English Channel against the chalk cliffs, and the ceaseless whisper of the wind about the eaves. It was a time of great upheaval for our nation, and even Holmes, in his self-imposed exile amongst his bees and his books, could not long remain untouched by the long shadow of the Great War. The affair began on a Tuesday in late autumn. A persistent drizzle had set in, tapping a mournful rhythm upon the window panes, and a good fire crackled in the hearth, its cheerful sound a welcome counterpoint to the gloom. Holmes was sunk deep in his armchair, a formidable chemical treatise open upon his lap, when the sharp rap of the door-knocker echoed through the small cottage. Our good Mrs. Hudson bustled in, her expression one of mild disapproval. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes. A Chief Inspector Davies from Newhaven. He says it is a matter of some urgency," remarked Martha Hudson. "Urgency, Mrs. Hudson. The only urgency in Sussex is the turning of the tide. Show him in," Sherlock Holmes noted. Holmes did not look up from his book, but I saw the familiar flicker of interest in his keen grey eyes. Chief Inspector Davies was a sturdy, square-jawed man whose damp overcoat bespoke a hurried journey. He stood awkwardly for a moment on the rug, his boots leaving wet prints upon the flagstones. "Mr. Holmes, I apologize for the intrusion. I would not have troubled your retirement, but this is a queer business," answered Chief Inspector Davies. Holmes's voice, a low, clear baritone, cut through the quiet. "You have come from London, Inspector, not Newhaven. The 10:15 from Victoria, I should judge, and you have not stopped for luncheon. Pray, take a seat and state your business, for you are allowing a considerable draught to enter my home," Sherlock Holmes noted. The inspector started, glancing down at the faint smudge of London clay on his boot heel, a detail which had evidently not escaped Holmes's sweeping glance. He took the offered chair, his brow furrowed with concern. "It concerns the death of a railwayman, Thomas Corbin. He was found this morning in his signal box on the coastal line. The local constabulary have ruled it a suicide, self-inflicted wound. The door was locked from the inside." "It seems straightforward," answered Chief Inspector Davies. "Then why, Inspector, are you here dampening Mrs. Hudson's rug?" observed Sherlock Holmes. Davies leaned forward, his voice dropping to a more conspiratorial tone, the sound barely rising above the crackle of the fire. "Because of where the signal box is, sir. It sits high on the cliff, with a perfect commanding view of the shipping lanes. Every vessel entering or leaving New Haven Harbour passes beneath it. In peacetime, it is a lonely post. In wartime, it is a watchtower. And with German U-boats sinking our ships in the Channel, a man in that box could do more damage with a signal lantern than a platoon of soldiers could with rifles," remarked Chief Inspector Davies. A profound silence fell upon the room, broken only by the hiss of a log settling in the grate. Holmes slowly closed his book, the soft thud of its cover echoing the gravity of the inspector's words. He placed it carefully upon the side table and steepled his long, thin fingers beneath his chin, his gaze fixed upon some distant point beyond the rain-streaked window. A lonely signalman, a locked room, and a view of the English Channel. You suggest that this Mr. Corbin's suicide may have been a matter of national security rather than personal despair. You have done well to come to me, Inspector, very well indeed. I shall require a visit to this unquiet cliff of yours. Watson, fetch my travelling cloak, Sherlock Holmes said. Our trap rattled from the station along a narrow track of shingle and dried mud, caught between the railway embankment and the grey, churning English Channel. A relentless wind, sharp with sea salt, tore at our coats and whipped spray against the windows. My companion for this grim journey, Dr. Alastair Reed, a sober and thoughtful local physician, huddled into his collar. Holmes, by contrast, seemed invigorated by the tempest. His hawk-like features turned towards the sea, as if discerning some clue upon the very waves. At last we saw it, a lonely wooden box perched atop the embankment, a glass-fronted sentinel against the brooding sky. The crunch of our boots on the gravel path up to it was the only sound to challenge the ceaseless moan of the wind. Inside, the air was still and cold, heavy with the scent of coal dust and stale oil. The body of the signalman, Thomas Corbin, lay slumped in a high-backed chair, a dark stain upon his chest marking the tragedy. Dr. Reed moved forward with quiet professionalism, his examination brief but thorough. "It is precisely as I reported to the constabulary. A single self-inflicted wound. The powder burns, the proximity. It all points to the lamentable conclusion they have already reached." Dr. Alastair Reed answered. His low voice was tinged with the weariness of a man who had seen too much of life's bleakest moments. "A lonely life out here, Mr. Holmes. I cannot say I am entirely surprised. The war has put a strain on many a solitary soul." Holmes offered a non-committal grunt in reply. His attention was not upon the unfortunate victim, but upon the room itself. His grey eyes swept over the floorboards, the polished levers, the small iron stove in the corner, and the grimy window that offered its panoramic and strategically vital view of the sea. The silence in the box was profound, broken only by the rattle of a loose window pane in its frame. "Doctor, you noted no signs of a struggle?" observed Sherlock Holmes. "None whatsoever. The man's own hands bore the powder residue. It is, I am afraid, a tragically straightforward matter," replied Dr. Alastair Reed. "And yet the floorboards tell a slightly different tale," Sherlock Holmes pointed out. He knelt, his long, thin finger tracing something upon the dusty wood near the door. I stooped beside him, just making out a series of faint, crescent-shaped scuffs, marring the otherwise uniform layer of grime. Marks easily overlooked, yet under Holmes's intense scrutiny they seemed to shout their significance. Scuff marks? They could have been made at any time. The man dragging a sack of coal, perhaps. Dr. Alistair Reed answered.
Holmes rose without comment and moved at last to the body of Thomas Corbin. He did not stoop to the wound, however. Instead, he leaned forward, his nose mere inches from the dead man's collar, and inhaled sharply. The sound was quiet, yet distinct in the oppressive stillness. He remained there for a moment, a statue of concentration, before straightening up, a flicker of cold light in his eyes. "Watson, what do you smell in this room?" Sherlock Holmes said. I considered for a moment. Coal dust, certainly, oil from the mechanisms, and the damp chill of the sea air. Dr. John Watson replied. Precisely. And yet, upon this man's collar, there is another scent, entirely alien to this environment. It is faint, but unmistakable. It is the acrid, salty tang of fish-packing brine, Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. Dr. Reed and I exchanged a look of complete bafflement. Holmes fixed us with a sharp gaze, his voice taking on the crisp, didactic tone I knew so well. A man who spends his days amidst coal and steel does not spontaneously acquire the odour of a fishing wharf. Those scuff marks by the door are not from a sack of coal. They are the marks of heavy, sea-worn boots dragged unwillingly. Our signalman did not die alone, gentlemen. He had a visitor, and that visitor came from the sea. This was not a suicide. It was an execution, disguised as one, deduced Sherlock Holmes. His words hung in the cold air with an unnerving finality. Dr. Reed and I could only stare, the simple suicide now transformed into a chilling execution. But Holmes, his theory confirmed, wasted no time on contemplation. Turning from the bleak scene, his mind already racing, he pulled on his gloves with a decisive snap. We have learned all we can from the dead. Now we must learn from the living. A man like Corbin, solitary as he was, must have been observed. We shall start at the local hub of all village life and gossip, the public house. Sherlock Holmes pointed out. The memory of that lonely signal box, with its acrid scent of fish-packing brine, so strangely at odds with the coal dust, lingered in my mind as Holmes directed our steps towards the Anchor's Rest. The public-house's lighted windows cast a warm, inviting glow against the encroaching twilight. As we pushed open the heavy oak door, a wave of noise and warmth washed over us, the clinking of glasses, the low murmur of local men discussing the war, and the crackle of a generous fire in the hearth. Behind the bar, a stout, red-faced man with a magnificent moustache polished a tankard. He looked up as we entered, his hearty welcome shifting to curiosity at the sight of two strangers. This, I presumed, was our man, Mr. Arthur Finch, I believe. My name is Holmes. I am assisting the constabulary with a small matter concerning the late Mr. Corbin, Sherlock Holmes responded. The publican set his tankard down with a decisive thud, his jovial demeanour hardening as his voice took on a booming authority that filled the small room. Corbin, you say? A bad business, a very bad business indeed. But not surprising, sir, not in the least. A strange bird was Thomas Corbin, kept to himself.
"Never a word for anyone if he could help it," remarked Mr. Arthur Finch. "In what manner was he strange, Mr. Finch?" "Beyond a simple desire for solitude," replied Sherlock Holmes.
"It was more than that," he replied sharply, leaning his considerable bulk over the polished bar. "It was his manner. Unpatriotic, I'd call it. We had a drive for war bonds last month, a collection for scrap metal before that. Every decent man in this village did his part, but not Corbin. Not a shilling, not a single pot or pan from his cottage. He'd just nod, that quiet, closed-off way of his, and walk on. A man who won't support our boys at the front, well, it makes you wonder where his loyalties truly lie, doesn't it?" remarked Mr. Arthur Finch.
Holmes listened with an unwavering, placid attention, his fingertips steepled before him. He offered no judgment, his face a mask of polite interest. "And did you ever observe him in any specific act of a suspicious nature? Meeting with strangers, perhaps, or showing an undue interest in the coastal traffic?" Sherlock Holmes pointed out. Finch snorted, a sound like a bull's impatient challenge. He picked up his cloth and polished the bar with renewed vigour. He was a signalman. His whole life was an undue interest in traffic, wasn't it? As for strangers, who's to say? A man that private could host the Kaiser himself for tea, and no one would be the wiser. No, sir. His crime, to my mind, was one of the spirit, a coldness, a lack of patriotic fire when the whole country is ablaze with it. That is evidence enough for me." Mr. Arthur Finch answered. A few moments later, we stepped back into the damp sea air as the tavern door creaked shut behind us. The rhythmic crash of waves against the shingle beach provided a sombre counterpoint to the pub's forced cheer. "Well, Holmes, that seems to be the popular opinion. A reclusive and unpatriotic man in a position of trust. It certainly paints a dark picture," Dr. John Watson said. Holmes stopped and turned to me, the faint gaslight catching the sharp planes of his face. His voice was low and thoughtful. "It paints a picture of Mr. Finch, Watson, not of Mr. Corbin. Our publican sees the world through a lens of furious patriotism. He measures a man's worth by the volume of his cheers and the depth of his pockets for the war effort. He has presented us with a compelling judgment of character, but not a single shred of tangible evidence. We have learned what the village thinks, but we still know nothing of the man himself," declared Sherlock Holmes. He fell silent then, his gaze fixed on the dark horizon. This avenue of public opinion had clearly yielded little of substance. The truth of the matter, I felt, would not be found in the loud pronouncements of a public house, but in some quieter, more personal place. Upon our return to Holmes's Sussex cottage, the coastal wind rattled the window panes, a constant reminder of the war across the Channel. Holmes stood before the hearth, coat shed, his sharp features cast in shadow and firelight. He had been silent since we left the Salty Mariner, his mind sifting through the publican's coarse gossip. Patriotism, Watson, is a noble virtue, but when it becomes a fever, it blinds a man as surely as the noonday sun. Finch sees a traitor in every shadow because the national mood demands it. His testimony is a reflection of fear, not a collection of facts. explained Sherlock Holmes. He fell silent again, poking at the coals with a fierceness that suggested his deep frustration. The case, it seemed, had reached an impasse, built upon the shaky foundations of local paranoia. Just then the door opened with a soft click, and our housekeeper, Martha Hudson, entered bearing a tray. Her tone was weighted with a genuine sadness that stood in stark contrast to the publican's righteous anger as she began. "A dreadful business about Mr. Corbin, sir. The village is full of the most awful talk. Whispers of him being in league with the enemy," Martha Hudson answered. Holmes replied, his eyes not leaving the fire. "I have heard as much. And what do you make of these whispers, Mrs. Hudson? You have a finer ear for the truth of this village than any constable," Sherlock Holmes noted. She straightened, her hands clasped, her expression hardening with protective pity. "They are fools, if you'll pardon my saying so, Mr. Holmes. They see a quiet man who keeps to himself and invent wickedness. They don't know what that poor soul was carrying. They don't know about his boy, his only son, Thomas," responded Martha Hudson. Holmes turned from the fireplace at last, his gaze now fixed entirely on Mrs. Hudson. The wind outside seemed to die down, and for a moment the only sound was the steady tick of the mantel clock. His voice was sharp with sudden, intense interest. "His son?" remarked Sherlock Holmes. Her voice trembled slightly as she delivered the heart of the matter. "A prisoner, sir, in a German camp. Has been for nearly a year. Mr. Corbin received a letter just last Tuesday through the proper channels. He wasn't the same after. My cousin saw him near the post office and said he looked as though he'd seen a ghost. Not a traitor, Mr. Holmes, a heartbroken father," answered Martha Hudson. With a slight curtsy, she departed, closing the door as quietly as she had entered. Her words hung in the profound silence, transforming the case entirely. The theory of greed or political conviction evaporated, replaced by a motive both more powerful and profoundly tragic. Holmes stood perfectly still, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the room's walls. He finally broke the stillness, his voice low and charged with a new energy. "Leverage, Watson. They had his son. A father's love twisted into a weapon of war. This is not the work of a simple spy, but of a master puppeteer who preys upon the soul. The police saw a crime of treason. I see a tragedy of coercion," explained Sherlock Holmes. He strode to the door and took his heavy coat from the hook, his movements once more filled with that electrifying purpose I knew so well. The man's actions may have been treasonous, but his motive was paternal. This changes everything. The signal box holds a secret, and I have been looking at it with the wrong eyes. I must go back, now. The revelation from our good Mrs. Hudson regarding the signalman's son had cast a pall over our little cottage. The notion of a man driven to treason was grim enough, but the possibility of a father coerced by such heartbreaking circumstances introduced a moral complexity that I found deeply unsettling. For Holmes, however, this new fact did not invite pity. Rather, it sharpened his focus, as if a smudged lens had suddenly been wiped clean. He said nothing of it that evening, but I observed him pacing before the fire long after I had retired, the smoke from his pipe wreathing his head like the very fogs of war that had descended upon our nation. He was gone before the sun had risen, leaving only a hastily scrawled note upon the mantelpiece. The line itself must speak, back by afternoon. True to his word, he returned as the light began to fail, his boots and trouser cuffs bearing the unmistakable grime of coal dust and railway ballast. Yet, despite his dishevelled appearance, there was a fire in his grey eyes I had come to recognize, the fierce gleam of the hunt when the scent of the quarry is finally, thrillingly, upon the wind. After a bath and a change of clothes, he settled into his armchair opposite me, the flickering firelight casting his aquiline features into sharp relief. For a long while the only sounds were the crackle of the logs and the mournful sigh of the wind as it swept in from the channel. At last he steepled his fingers and fixed his gaze upon me.
The official explanation, Watson, is elegant in its simplicity. A man, isolated and overwhelmed by the pressures of war, takes his own life. It is tidy, it is tragic, and it requires no further thought from our overworked constabulary. It is also entirely wrong, remarked Sherlock Holmes. He leaned forward, his gaze fixed upon me, and his voice dropped to a low, intense pitch.
I returned to that desolate stretch of track this morning with a single question. What could a man see from that box, and what could he communicate? The view of the channel is superb, but a signalman cannot simply wave a flag. The method must be subtle, repeatable, and invisible to the casual eye. I therefore dismissed the signal box itself and turned my attention to the permanent way, the rails and sleepers that form the very spine of the railway, replied Sherlock Holmes. He paused, letting the silence hang in the air. I pictured the crunch of his boots on the gravel, the metallic clang as his tools struck the iron rails. For 3 hours I laboured, Watson, on my hands and knees, examining each wooden sleeper in the quarter-mile stretch below the box. It was tedious, back-breaking work. And then I found it. On the seaward side of the line, almost perfectly obscured by a thick layer of soot and dust, was a faint marking in what appeared to be chalk, deduced Sherlock Holmes. My interest piqued. I sat up straighter in my chair. A mere scribble, perhaps, the work of a child or a railway ganger, responded Dr. John Watson. So I first concluded. But 10 yards further on, I found another, and then another. They were not random, my dear fellow. They were placed with geometric precision, always on the inner edge of the sleeper, where the shadow of the rail would best protect them from the rain. They were a sequence of simple lines and dots, deliberately faint, deliberately placed to be overlooked, declared Sherlock Holmes. He rose from his chair and began to pace again, his restless energy too great to be contained by stillness. There was a sharp thrill of discovery in his voice. This was no idle graffiti. This was a message, a sophisticated, recurring code laid out upon the very tracks, visible only to one who knew precisely where and how to look. Corbin was not merely a signalman, Watson. He was a semaphore, and his tragic death was not an end, but an interruption. He stopped before the window, staring out into the blackness of the night that pressed against the glass. The enormity of his discoveries settled upon me. A secret language written in chalk upon a lonely railway line, speaking of treason and naval movements to an unseen enemy. The question is no longer whether espionage occurred, The question now is one of translation. I have the text, Watson. Now I must find the key," Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. With that, he turned and strode purposefully towards his study, the room where maps, ciphers, and obscure monographs lay waiting. The soft click of the door latch closing behind him seemed to mark the beginning of a new and far more perilous chapter in our investigation. Upon our return to Baker Street, the familiar, comfortable chaos of our lodgings seemed a world away from the wind-swept Sussex coast. Yet the grim reality of our investigation had followed us home. For 2 days, Holmes was a man possessed, a whirlwind of frantic energy confined to the space between the fireplace and his chemical table. The air grew thick with the scent of his strongest shag tobacco. The floor became a treacherous landscape of arcane monographs, nautical charts, and sheets of paper covered in his spidery scrawl. The only sounds were the rustle of turning pages, the scratch of his pen, and the hiss and crackle of the fire in the grate. I had attempted to engage him in conversation on the first evening, but was met with a distracted wave of the hand. He was deep in the intellectual chase, and I knew better than to disturb him. On the second night, a mournful rain began to lash against the window panes. Suddenly, he threw down his pen with a clatter that made me start. "It is useless, Watson, utterly useless. The markings correspond to no known military or commercial cipher. I have cross-referenced every variation of the Polybius square, and even the wretched visionaire, which any schoolboy could solve." "It is all gibberish," stated Sherlock Holmes. He paced the room like a caged tiger, his brow furrowed in a mask of profound frustration. He snatched a sheet of paper where he had meticulously copied the chalk marks from the railway sleepers. He stared at it, his grey eyes narrowed to slits. The silence stretched, broken only by the drumming of the rain and the ticking of the mantelpiece clock. Then a sudden stillness fell over him. His head cocked to one side, and a strange light flickered in his eyes. Of course. How could I have been so blind? We have been trying to read a sentence, Watson, when we should have been reading a map," observed Sherlock Holmes. Before I could ask him to elucidate, he darted to a dusty corner of his library, clambering upon a chair with an agility that belied his years, and pulled down a heavy, leather-bound volume. A small cloud of dust billowed into the lamplight as he dropped it onto the table with a solid thud. He blew the dust from the cover, revealing the title embossed in faded gilt. "Tidal Patterns and Navigational Symbology of the German Imperial Navy by one von Reiter, an obscure monograph from 1908. I recalled a footnote regarding its author's peculiar system for annotating coastal charts. A signature system, you see. He did not use standard symbols for depth and current, but a private shorthand. "Look here," replied Sherlock Holmes. His long, thin finger traced a line across the open page, then moved to his copy of the chalk marks. The connection was instantaneous and breathtaking. The seemingly random collection of dots, crosses, and crescents was not a letter-based cipher at all. It was a direct transcription of von Reiter's cartographical symbols. For the next hour, Holmes worked in a silent fever of discovery, cross-referencing the symbols with a naval chart of the English Channel. At last he pushed the papers towards me, his face grim. "Read it, Watson." This was chalked upon the line 3 nights ago. It is not merely espionage. It is a death warrant delivered on a timetable. Sherlock Holmes noted. I picked up the sheet. His translation was chilling in its precision. It listed the names of British merchant vessels, their tonnage, and their exact times of departure from Newhaven. But the final line was the most damning. Convoy escort HMS Pathfinder departs 0400. 3 destroyers. Course set for Dieppe. It was a detailed schedule for a U-boat captain. The poor signalman was not merely a cog in the machine. He was the very man who ensured the U-boat's torpedoes would find their mark. The information is too precise to be seen from the signal box alone. It must be passed to Corbin. But the chalk marks themselves, they are the final transmission. They are left in a place of public access, yet hidden in plain sight. This implies they must be collected, and quickly. He stood and walked to the window. He peered out into the rain-swept darkness of Baker Street, as if he could see the Sussex coastline itself. A man in a train would not see them, nor would a casual railway worker think twice. No, Watson, the accomplice who retrieves this deadly information must travel on foot. Our next step is clear. We must walk the accomplice's path. The decrypted messages lay upon Holmes's desk, a testament to a cold and calculating treachery that chilled me to the marrow, far more than the November air. Holmes, however, was invigorated. By morning, we were on a wind-swept path clinging to the Sussex cliffs. Below us, the grey channel churned, waves crashing against the chalk with a percussive roar as a sharp, salt-laced wind whipped our coats. The messages, Watson, are but one half of the equation. A signal is useless unless it is received. Consider the means of retrieval, remarked Sherlock Holmes. He pointed with his cane towards the railway line, a thin iron ribbon running parallel to our path before disappearing into a cutting. No unscheduled stop of a train, for that would be logged and investigated within the hour. No boat could approach these cliffs in the dead of night without being dashed to pieces. Therefore, the recipient must have come by the simplest method of all. He came on foot, along this very track. His logic, as ever, proved unassailable. We were walking in a traitor's footsteps. We continued in silence, the only sounds the cry of a distant gull and the crunch of our boots on gravel. Rounding a bend, we came upon a figure huddled against a rocky outcrop. He was a fisherman, his face a road map of sea and weather, busily mending a tough-looking net. "A good day to you. The fish seem unwilling to bite in this weather," Sherlock Holmes responded. The man looked up, his eyes a pale, washed-out blue. He gave a gap-toothed smile, his voice a low burr, thick with the local accent. "Aye, sir, the wind keeps 'em deep, but a patient man can find a living. You gentlemen looking for a good spot," Silas Croft said. "We are merely admiring the view. The naval presence is quite formidable," deduced Sherlock Holmes. Holmes gestured vaguely towards the sullen sea. The fisherman squinted, nodding slowly. "That it is, sir. A comfort to us all. If you're ever casting a line, mind, the best time is just after the 7:40 patrol passes that chalk headland. She steams out, regular as clockwork. Gives a man a clear hour before she's back. The bass run thick in her wake, they do," remarked Silas Croft. I thought it a friendly, if curious, piece of local advice. Holmes merely thanked him, and we walked on. But no sooner was the fisherman out of earshot than Holmes stopped dead in his tracks. His face, which had been relaxed in casual conversation, was now a mask of intense concentration. "What is it, Holmes?" Dr. John Watson said. "Did you hear it, Watson? The flaw in the tapestry. A fisherman knows the tides, the wind, the habits of his catch. He does not know, to the minute, the patrol schedule of a Royal Navy destroyer." Sherlock Holmes responded, "Regular as clockwork. That is not the observation of a fisherman, Watson. It is the knowledge of a spotter, an accomplice." He let the words hang in the salt-laced air, their implications settling upon me with a dreadful weight. "Ah, Mr. Corbin may have sent the signals, but I believe we have just met the man who collected them. We must now understand what drove Corbin to such a desperate act. To his cottage, Watson. That must be our next step." The following morning, the sea mist had not yet relinquished its grip upon the Sussex coast, lending a ghostly quality to our mission. Armed with a warrant secured by the tireless Chief Inspector Davies, Holmes, Dr. Reed, and I were accompanied by a stout local constable to the late Mr. Corbin's cottage. The key turned in the lock with a grating, metallic protest, as if the small dwelling were loath to give up its secrets. A chill, smelling of stale pipe tobacco and damp wool, met us as we stepped across the threshold. It was a humble place, kept with a Spartan tidiness that spoke of a man accustomed to solitude. Dr. Reed moved to the window, his expression sombre as he peered out at the grey, churning sea. The only sound was the mournful cry of a distant gull and the soft scuff of our boots on the bare floorboards. A lonely existence. One can see how despair might take root in such isolation, responded Dr. Alistair Reed. Despair, yes, but of what nature? That is the question. A man does not typically hide the evidence of simple melancholy, Sherlock Holmes pointed out. Holmes's eyes, sharp and restless, scanned every corner of the room, dismissing the meagre furniture with a glance. He paced the floor once, twice, his footfalls unnaturally loud in the silence. Then he stopped dead in front of the small blackened hearth. He knelt, not to inspect the cold ashes, but the floorboards before it. "Observe, Reed. These boards are worn by 1,000 passages from chair to door. Yet this one here bears a different kind of scar. See these small, fresh indentations near the edge. Not the mark of a boot heel, but of a tool. A poker, perhaps, used as a lever." He withdrew a sturdy clasp knife from his pocket and, with the constable's permission, inserted the blade into the narrow gap. The board groaned in protest before lifting clear. There, in the shallow, dusty hollow beneath, lay a folded piece of paper, crumpled as if from much anxious handling. Holmes retrieved it with the utmost care. He unfolded it and began to read, his face a mask of concentration. The silence in the room deepened, broken only by the rustle of the paper in his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and devoid of its usual triumphant energy, replaced by something far graver. It is not a suicide note. It is an unsent confession, a letter to his sister in Portsmouth, deduced Sherlock Holmes. He cleared his throat and began to read aloud, his voice giving life to the dead man's tortured script.
"Dearest Mary," he began, "forgive me, for I am trapped. They have my boy. They send me proof that young Thomas lives, but only if I do as they command. They know his camp near Freiburg. They say a word from them means his life, or a slow death from neglect. Every light I show, every signal I relay, is a nail in England's coffin, but it is a breath in my son's lungs. I can bear it no more. Tonight I will refuse them. I will meet the man on the path and tell him it is finished, whatever the cost. God help me, and God help my Thomas."
Holmes fell silent, the dead man's desperate plea hanging heavy in the cold air. Dr. Reed let out a slow, pained breath. "Good heavens, the poor man! He was blackmailed," answered Dr. Alastair Reed. Holmes stood, the letter still held loosely in his fingers. He stared not at us, but through the grimy window towards the coastal path where the fisherman plied his trade. His gaze was distant, his mind clearly working at a furious pace, fitting this terrible new piece into the puzzle.
Blackmailed, yes, but that is no longer the most important word in this room. He resolved to stop. He was going to meet his contact and refuse, and on that very night he was found dead. This was not a suicide born of guilt, Reed. This was a murder born of defiance, explained Sherlock Holmes. The fire in our Baker Street hearth had dwindled to a sullen red glow, casting long dancing shadows across the familiar chaos of Holmes's study. Outside, the great city was hushed, the rumble of late traffic a distant and intermittent murmur. For what seemed an hour, the only sounds in the room were the soft sigh of the embers and the rustle of paper, as Holmes, a hawk-like figure in his worn dressing-gown, paced before the mantelpiece. On the central table, illuminated by the green-shaded lamp, lay the tragic, unsent letter of Thomas Corbin, a stark white island in a sea of chemical apparatus and scattered notes. At last he came to a halt. He turned to face me, and in the dim light I saw that his grey eyes were alight with a feverish, triumphant blaze. The period of intense, silent synthesis was over. The moment of revelation was at hand. "Watson, we have been viewing this canvas from entirely the wrong perspective. We saw this as the confession of a traitor. It is nothing of the sort. It is the final testament of a patriot," stated Sherlock Holmes. I confess I stared at him, utterly bewildered by this pronouncement. The words on the page seemed to admit a guilt so profound as to be irrefutable. "A patriot, Holmes? But the man's own hand confesses to passing vital information to the enemy," responded Dr. John Watson. "Forced to it, my dear fellow, coerced by a leverage so monstrous it might break any man, the life of his own son. But consider the other evidence in light of this new terrible knowledge. The chalk marks upon the railway sleepers were not signals from Corbin, but instructions to him. The brine upon his boots was not from some idle walk along the shingle, but from a clandestine meeting aboard a fishing boat, a boat that could come and go with the tide," Sherlock Holmes noted. His words painted a vivid and chilling picture. The disparate threads of the case were being drawn together by a master hand, and the pattern they formed was one of far greater complexity than I had imagined. And then we have this, the keystone. In this letter, which he never had the chance to post, Thomas Corbin declares his intention to stop. He could no longer bear the weight of his actions. He resolved to defy his tormentors, whatever the cost to his son and to himself. He chose his duty over his blood. Sherlock Holmes noted,
"A profound and sorrowful silence fell between us, broken only by a sudden gust of wind that rattled the window pane in its frame. The sheer tragedy of the signalman's dilemma was overwhelming. Then his suicide, responded Dr. John Watson, was no suicide at all. His voice turned as hard and sharp as flint. It was murder, Watson, cunningly staged to appear as the final act of a guilty conscience. Corbin met his contact that night to deliver his refusal. That contact, an agent of unquestionable ruthlessness, realized his source was lost, and worse, that Corbin would likely expose the entire network. He could not permit it. He silenced the signalman forever, arranging the scene to tell a false tale of shame, thereby protecting himself and his masters. Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. The cold, impeccable logic of it sent a shiver down my spine. It was a scheme of diabolical ingenuity. Good heavens, Holmes! But who could it be? Dr. John Watson commented, "The man with the perfect cover, the constant access to the coast, and the motive to direct suspicion elsewhere from the very beginning. The man who could meet Corbin at sea under the cloak of his profession. The very fisherman who was so quick to note Corbin's odd behaviour to the publican, a clever gambit to establish his own patriotic bona fides. Our murderer is Silas Croft," observed Sherlock Holmes. Holmes moved to the window and drew back the heavy curtain, staring down into the gas-lit emptiness of Baker Street. A lone hansom cab clattered past, the sound of its horse's hooves echoing sharply in the night air. His entire posture spoke of a mind that had already leapt from conclusion to action. "The time for deduction is over, Watson." His voice was a low, determined murmur, more to himself than to me. "The time for action is at hand. I shall wire the Chief Inspector at first light. We must spring the trap before our quarry takes fright and slips the net for good," Sherlock Holmes pointed out. The small sitting-room of Holmes's Sussex cottage felt unnaturally taut. The only sounds the spit and crackle of the hearth-fire and the mournful cry of the wind against the window-panes. By the lamplight, 3 figures formed a grim tableau. Chief Inspector Davies, solid and impatient, occupied one armchair, his gaze fixed upon my friend. Across from him sat the fisherman, Silas Croft, his weathered face a mask of wary composure. Between them, standing before the mantelpiece, was Holmes himself, his tall, spare figure casting a long, dancing shadow upon the wall. Holmes's voice, when he finally spoke, was calm and measured, cutting through the tension with a surgeon's precision. "I have asked you both here this evening to put an end to speculation. The death of Thomas Corbin was no suicide, Inspector. It was a murder, calculated and executed to protect a matter of the highest treason," observed Sherlock Holmes. Davies grunted, a sound of gruff acknowledgment. My eyes, however, were on Silas Croft. The fisherman did not so much as flinch, his hands resting as placidly as carved oak on his knees.
He looked for all the world like a man with nothing to hide, a performance I knew would soon crumble. Croft's tone was one of mild curiosity, the rough burr of the coast in every syllable. "Murder, you say, sir? A terrible business. But what has it to do with an old fisherman like me?" remarked Silas Croft.
"It has everything to do with you, Mr. Croft. Let us begin with the chalk marks upon the railway sleepers beneath the signal box. An idle doodle, perhaps? No, a simple yet effective code. A vertical line to signal a clear channel for a U-boat, a horizontal one to warn it away. A code conveyed to you on your fishing boat by means of a lantern from that very signal box," explained Sherlock Holmes. "I saw it then, the first hairline crack in the man's facade. A subtle tightening around his eyes, a muscle that pulsed for a moment in his jaw. He remained silent, but his gaze, now locked on Holmes, had lost its placid curiosity and gained the hard glint of a predator assessing a threat. Corbin was not a willing traitor. He was a patriot ensnared. You discovered his son was a prisoner of war in Germany and used that terrible fact as a lever. You blackmailed him, forcing him to pass your signals, preying upon a father's love to serve the Kaiser's war machine," explained Sherlock Holmes. The inspector shifted in his seat, his breathing a harsh counterpoint to the crackling fire. My own gaze, however, was fixed on Croft. The fisherman's knuckles had grown bone-white where he gripped the arms of his chair, a stark betrayal of the calm he fought to maintain. The inspector's voice, when it came, was a low growl, thick with disbelief and dawning anger. "This is a damnable accusation, Holmes," remarked Chief Inspector Davies. "It is the damnable truth, and the proof lies in this." Holmes produced from his pocket the crumpled, unsent letter we had found. Corbin could bear the burden no longer. He wrote this confession, intending to post it, to end his part in the scheme. He resolved to stop signalling. But you, Croft, could not allow that. Your entire operation was at risk, declared Sherlock Holmes. Holmes took a single, deliberate step forward, his eyes like chips of ice. The very air in the room seemed to thicken, charged and heavy with the unspoken threat of violence. "And so, on that stormy night, you paid him a visit. You confronted him, discovered his intention, and knew you had to silence him. You murdered Thomas Corbin to protect your web of treason, and then staged his death to look like the act of a man destroyed by guilt. But it was not guilt that killed him, Mr. Croft. It was you." Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. The accusation hung in the air, absolute and final. For a long second the silence was broken only by the hiss of the fire. Then I saw the fisherman's feigned composure shatter entirely, replaced by a wild, cornered look. His body tensed, coiling like a spring, and the legs of his chair shrieked against the floorboards as he prepared to bolt. The silence that followed Holmes's accusation was profound and heavy, broken only by the spit and crackle of the logs in the hearth. Outside, the wind howled its mournful tune across the downs, a fitting soundtrack to the drama in our small cottage. Silas Croft, the fisherman, froze. His weathered face, a mask of disbelief, slowly hardened into pure fury. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the arms of his chair. He finally found his voice, a snarl dredged from his very depths. "Lies! You spin a madman's fantasy, you and your London policeman. You've no proof of any of it," Silas Croft said. Holmes did not raise his voice. It grew quieter, yet sliced through the fisherman's bluster with surgical precision. Proof? The chalk marks were suggestive, the letter damning. But men in your profession, Mr. Croft, are careless with their tools. You used a fisherman's knot, a carrick bend, if I am not mistaken, to secure the rope from which poor Corbin was found hanging. A signalman would have no cause to know such a knot. It is, however, second nature to a man who has spent his life upon the sea, remarked Sherlock Holmes. That final, irrefutable detail broke him. Croft's eyes, wide with panic, darted to the door. In one explosive movement, he launched himself from his seat, the heavy oak chair crashing backwards with a tremendous clatter. His desperate bid for freedom was futile. Chief Inspector Davies, poised like a patient predator, moved with a speed that belied his solid frame. A brief, ugly scuffle, the thud of colliding bodies, a strangled gasp from Croft, and the sharp, metallic snap of handcuffs. It was over in seconds. The fisherman stood panting between us, head bowed in utter defeat, the fight draining from him as swiftly as the tide from a shingle beach. His voice was grim, heavy with the weight of his duty. "Silas Croft, I am arresting you for the murder of Thomas Corbin and for acts of treason against the Crown," said Chief Inspector Davies. His resistance vanished. Slumping into a different chair, Croft began to speak, his voice a hollow, defeated monotone. He confessed everything. Contacts in France, the lure of German gold, the simple system of signals guiding U-boats to their prey. Corbin, tormented by his own secret, had stumbled upon one of Croft's signals. The ensuing confrontation in the signal box, a desperate struggle, ended in the railwayman's death, a crime Croft hastily disguised as suicide. His voice trembled slightly as he concluded, a pathetic wreck of a man. "He saw me. He wasn't meant to be looking. He said he would tell. I had no choice. It was him or me," remarked Silas Croft. The confession hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Chief Inspector Davies stood staring down at the prisoner, not with triumph, but with a profound and troubled weariness settling upon his face. He ran a hand over his jaw, his gaze distant. He spoke quietly, almost to himself. "So one traitor is undone by another. This war, it makes a mockery of simple justice. Corbin sells his soul for his son, and you sell your country for coin. God help us all," Chief Inspector Davies replied. Holmes, watching the inspector intently, offered a quiet reply. "Justice is rarely simple, Inspector. It is a treacherous coast, and a man may be wrecked upon it by many currents, not all of his own making," replied Sherlock Holmes. Davies gave a curt nod and led his prisoner into the blustering night. The crunch of their boots on the gravel path faded until the wind swallowed the sound. Holmes and I were left in the room's sudden stillness, the fire hissing in the grate. My friend stood motionless, staring into the flames, his expression pensive, as if solving the crime was merely a prelude to grappling with the far greater puzzle of its cause. The case of the treasonous tide is not one I often recount, for its conclusion brought little of the satisfaction that typically accompanies the resolution of a puzzle. The guilty party was apprehended, and a threat to our shores was neutralized. Yet a profound melancholy clung to the affair. I find the truest summation of the matter not in my own notes, but in the final entry of Holmes's ledger on the subject. He penned it some days after our return to Baker Street, though its heart lies on the wind-swept Sussex downs. I reproduce it here, for it reveals more of the man than any victory. Holmes's own words from his casebook begin here. The day after Davies had departed, his duty done, but his spirit troubled, I found myself walking the high downs with Dr. Reed. A brisk wind, tasting of salt and damp earth, swept in from the channel, whipping at our coats. Below us, the sea was a sheet of hammered pewter under a sky of bruised grey clouds. The only sounds were the rush of that wind through the hardy gorse and the rhythmic crunch of our boots upon the chalky path. It is difficult to imagine such treachery being plotted amidst this raw beauty, is it not? One feels a man ought to be his best self up here, said Dr. Alistair Reed. Reed's voice was gentle, a physician's balm against the harshness of the elements and of our recent business. I stopped, turning my collar against a particularly sharp gust before I answered. On the contrary, Doctor, it is precisely in such isolation that a man's soul is tested. Down there, in the towns, patriotism is a chorus. Up here, with only the gulls for company, it is a solitary verse, easily forgotten when a more pressing melody is introduced. Deduced Sherlock Holmes. We walked on in silence for a time, the grey sea stretching towards a France engulfed in unimaginable conflict. My thoughts were not with the fisherman spy, a simple creature of greed, but with Thomas Corbin, the signalman, a man caught not between nations, but between two impossible duties. Tell me, Reed, what is the greater treason? To betray a country that demands your son for its cannons, or to betray that same country to save him? Corbin was no villain. He was a father, ensnared in a devil's bargain, explained Sherlock Holmes. A bargain this war has forced upon countless men. The pressures are immense. I see it in my surgery every day. The strain on those left behind. Dr. Alistair Reed answered. Indeed, this conflict has redrawn all my maps of human morality. It has blurred the lines between hero and villain until the two are almost indistinguishable. For years I have pursued justice as a fixed point, a north star in the chaos of human affairs. Now I find the star has shifted. In a world that sanctions mass slaughter, the quiet treason of a desperate father seems a regrettably small sin. He was a casualty of this war as surely as any soldier fallen in Flanders, observed Sherlock Holmes. Here I closed the ledger, the scent of old paper and ink filling the quiet of our sitting-room. Outside, the familiar rumble of a London omnibus was a comforting anchor to a world that felt, for a moment, unsteady. Holmes never spoke of the case again, but I saw its mark upon him. In the years that followed, a new current of compassion ran beneath the cold river of his logic. The great detective had solved the puzzle of the signal box, but it was the ghost of Thomas Corbin, a quiet man who loved his son too much, that had presented him with a mystery of the human heart that would never truly be resolved.